The prison gates don't creak open for drama. They open for paperwork. At 8:11 a.m., on a grey morning soaked in drizzle, a man steps across a faded yellow line painted on cracked concrete. Behind him stands a Category B prison. High walls, cameras stitched across the skyline, a place designed to hold men society isn't ready to trust. In front of him is freedom. Or something that looks like it. He's carrying everything he owns in a thin plastic bag. There's no embrace. No fanfare. Just a guard's nod and the mechanical thud of steel doors sealing shut behind him. This moment is supposed to be an ending. For him, it was only the beginning. Because 72 hours later, police would kick in a door before dawn. The same name would light up the system. And the words no ex-prisoner ever once tied to their release would appear in black and white, rearrested. Not months later. Not years later. Days later. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're re-watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. This is not a story about one bad decision. It's a story about a system that lets people out without letting them go. About old enemies waiting on the outside. About promises broken before the ink on release papers dries. And about the terrifying truth few people talk about. For some men, prison doesn't end at the gate. It just changes address. Before the headlines, before the arrest report, before his name became a statistic, there was a man who believed this time would be different. Let's call him Daniel Mercer. Not because that is his real name, but because what happened to him has happened to dozens of others, across England, across Europe, across the world. His case was documented, dissected, debated, and quietly forgotten. Daniel grew up in a housing estate shadowed by steel fences and CCTV poles, where the lift rarely worked and opportunity took the stairs, away from you. By 14, he knew the routine. Police cars at night, arguments that spilled into stairwells, friends disappearing into youth detention centers and coming back harder, quieter. Daniel wasn't violent. He wasn't reckless. He was desperate. And desperation has a way of wearing a uniform. The crime that started it all. Daniel's first arrest didn't come with sirens. It came with a knock. One too polite to be ignored. He was 22, working off and on jobs, carrying debt like a second shadow. The offense? Armed robbery. No injuries, no shots fired, but enough threat to land him a serious sentence. Court documents would later say he played a minor role. But prisons don't do minor. They do time. Daniel was sent to a Category B prison, one designed for men who can be trusted in open conditions but aren't considered the highest risk. A place balanced between control and chaos. This was where time slowed down and reputations moved fast. Inside, Daniel learned lessons no school teaches. You learn who to speak to, and who never to look at. You learn how silence can protect you better than honesty. And you learn that freedom is a currency traded in favors and patience. He kept his head down, worked in the prison workshop, and avoided debt. But prison has a memory. And memories have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them. After serving most of his sentence, Daniel qualified for early release under strict conditions. Approved housing, regular check-ins, zero contact with known offenders, and immediate recall if any conditions were breached. On paper, it looked fair. In reality, it was a tightrope. His probation officer, overworked, underfunded, gave him a list of places to avoid. Names, streets, numbers he was supposed to erase from his life. Daniel nodded. Signed. Promised. What no form accounts for is gravity. And gravity always pulls you back to where you came from. There are no speeches on release day. Just a final search. A clipboard signature. And the cold air hitting your face like it doesn't recognize you anymore. Daniel walked out alone. No family waiting. No friends allowed. Only a council-arranged hostel, 2 bus rides away, and the echo of prison doors still ringing in his ears. That first night, he slept fully clothed. The second night, he barely slept at all. Freedom was louder than prison ever was. On day 1, the world had moved on without him. Outside, everything had changed. Phones were smarter. People were colder. Money moved digitally, something Daniel had never learned to do. He tried to follow the rules. He really did. But rules don't protect you from running into the past. On day 2, walking back from a job center appointment, he heard his name spoken in a voice he hadn't heard in years. A voice he was forbidden to answer. And that moment, The pause, the choice, the single glance over his shoulder would later be marked as the beginning of the end. CCTV caught it first. Daniel standing too close to someone he wasn't allowed to know. Too long. Too familiar. At the time, no one acted. But in systems like this, nothing disappears. It waits. Pressure builds. By the third night, Daniel was unraveling. The hostel was overcrowded. Sleep was a memory. Old habits whispered like solutions. Someone offered him a quick favor. No violence. No theft. Just a delivery. Daniel hesitated. Then agreed. He told himself it wasn't crime. It was survival. History would disagree. 72 hours later, at 5:04 a.m., police surrounded the building. A warrant. Probation recall. Additional charges pending. Daniel didn't resist. He didn't shout. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands shaking, as officers read out words he'd been released from less than a week earlier. You are being recalled to prison effective immediately. Freedom had lasted 3 days. The media barely noticed. A short article. A statistic. Another failure to reintegrate. What they didn't ask was why this keeps happening. Why so many men walk out of prison, only to walk straight back in. Daniel's case isn't rare. Across the UK, a significant percentage of released prisoners are recalled within weeks. Not because of new violent crimes, but because of technical breaches, immense pressure, or simple desperation. The question that haunts this story isn't, what did he do wrong? It's, was he ever really free? The ride back to prison was silent. No handcuffs, no shouting. Just a quiet journey in the back of a police van, the kind with scratched plastic windows and a faint, lingering smell. Daniel stared at his reflection in the dark glass. For a moment, he couldn't tell if he was going forward or backward in time. 3 days ago, these same roads meant freedom. Now, every mile felt like a subtraction. The prison appeared on the horizon long before they arrived. Concrete walls rising like something permanent, something that had been waiting for him. He saw the same gates, the same yellow line on the ground. Except this time, he was crossing it the wrong way. Inside reception, the officers didn't ask many questions. They didn't need to. Recall cases move fast. His personal belongings were logged. His street clothes were swapped for a uniform. His name was reduced back to a number he thought he'd retired forever. One officer glanced at the computer system and shook his head slightly. Didn't take long, he muttered. That single sentence would follow Daniel for years. On paper, the recall looked straightforward. Violation of release conditions. Association with prohibited individuals. Suspected involvement in criminal activity. There was no new conviction. No trial. Just suspicion. And in this system, suspicion is enough. It didn't need him to be guilty. It only needed him to be non-compliant. And compliance, on the outside, had proven much harder than anyone ever warned him it would be. Behind every recall is a file, often thick with warnings that no one reads. Daniel's probation file told a quieter, more desperate story. It noted his inadequate housing placement. It mentioned a missed mental health evaluation because of transport issues. It showed limited access to employment support and no listed family contact. None of these were technical breaches, but together, they formed a pattern that the system rarely forgives. He was a man who was technically free, but practically stranded. While Daniel sat in a holding wing, detectives were working quietly in the background. They pulled CCTV footage from the street where he'd been seen. They traced phone pings. They interviewed the person he wasn't supposed to talk to. There were no allegations of violence, no weapons recovered. But something else was circulating, a network trying to use newly released men as disposable messengers. It was low risk for them, high reward. And now, Daniel's name was attached to it. From his cell, Daniel could hear the familiar sounds of the prison waking up. The shouts, the clang of metal doors, the footsteps echoing down corridors that felt narrower the second time around. Returning prisoners carry a special kind of shame. Not for the crime that sent them there in the first place, but for failing after they got out. The other inmates didn't ask what happened. They already knew the story. Daniel waited weeks for a hearing. Weeks where every night blurred into the next, where hope grew thin and sharp, like something that could cut you if you held it the wrong way. His solicitor finally explained it in plain terms. You haven't been charged with a new crime, he said. But they don't need that. The breach of your license is enough to bring you back. Daniel let out a short, tired laugh. So I was released, he said, without ever really being released. The solicitor didn't disagree. The courtroom was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the sterile, controlled quiet of a hospital, where emotions are kept in check. The judge listened to arguments about risk, public safety, and probability. Words like potential and likelihood seemed to matter more than actual facts. Daniel spoke just once, very briefly. He talked about the hostel he was placed in, his appointment at the job center, and how he heard his name called from across a street he was specifically told to avoid. He didn't beg or make excuses. He just explained. But the recall was upheld. There was no dramatic gavel slam, just a quiet decision. Daniel would remain in custody, restarting a cycle that had already failed him once. He walked out of the courtroom feeling heavier than when he entered, even though he was carrying nothing. Outside, life just went on. But inside, time began to collapse all over again. Daniel became a statistic. Official figures show that a huge number of prison recalls happen within the first month of release, often for technical breaches like unstable housing or unavoidable contact. They call it failure to comply, but compliance assumes you have a choice. Weeks later, investigators dropped the suspicion that led to his recall. No charges, not enough evidence. But Daniel wasn't released. The recall order was still valid. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. The belief that trying, that making an effort, actually mattered. It just started to drain away. That kind of loss is much harder to measure than time served. Months into his recall, a review uncovered something buried in his file. Daniel's approved housing, the hostel, had been flagged as a problem even before his release. Concerns were raised, warnings were logged, but there were no other options available. So, they released him anyway, into a situation where meeting his conditions was nearly impossible. The system didn't break. It worked exactly as it was designed to. So, was Daniel set up to fail? Or was his failure just the cost of keeping the system running smoothly? His case led to a quiet internal review. No press conference, no apology. Just a new note added to a checklist somewhere. Today, Daniel is still inside. He's older, quieter, and wiser in ways that don't show up on any report. He doesn't count the days anymore. He counts expectations. This story isn't about making excuses. It's about a harsh reality. It's about what happens when a release date looks good on paper, but a real life can't just restart that easily. When freedom is conditional, fragile, and constantly monitored. And when the door opens, only to swing shut again before the sound even fades. The hardest part isn't the arrest, it's what comes after. Because once you're recalled, every future chance carries a shadow longer than the sentence itself. It leaves you wondering if freedom can be taken back in a matter of days. Was it ever really given at all? Thanks for watching.